they can support me, and there's like I know that it's gonna continue to attract people.
Yeah. So,
right?
so
Like I'm here, I'm an entrepreneur, but I'm not building businesses here because it doesn't make sense for me to do that right now. I'm actually like generating capital for myself, but I'm not raising the value of the A hotel at all because it's not at a point yet where it makes sense for me to start a business here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I suppose at the end of the day, you could say that we could. I mean, I guess there's no reason why the company can't create incentives for businesses to establish themselves. That's true. Yeah. It might make sense. It might make sense to sort of say to say to a corporation, if you actually like reach out, it may well make sense to like reach out once you've attracted the right people with community income. It might make sense to reach out to corporations and try and incentivize them to do something that makes use of that. That is a good point, and I think that makes sense.
Also, initially, I guess you could just attract kind of freelancers and digital nomads.
Yeah, I mean, I like I say, I don't.
They don't raise the value of the land, right?
Not initially, but like if you make millions from your internet businesses, and you decide to stick around.
I mean, if you have like one kind of little town where nothing really happens and where only like old people live, and then you get like a bunch of kind of young.
Yeah, I guess if you get enough people, you can start to attract businesses.
Yeah, the actual details of this process are definitely something that's going to have to be thought of quite carefully. When I first thought of the idea, I kind of thought it was simple. And I started talking to more and more people, and the more I kind of talked about it, I was like, actually, it's quite a complicated proposal. Exactly how to manage it to like maximize real estate value.
Well, you had this one part where you're like, well, all we have to do is find one thing where we can get, we can raise the value of the land higher than the value of the.
Yes.
But I think that's like every city tries to do this, and nobody's like actually cracked the code. Some people have sort of stumbled into it, like Silicon Valley or Portland or these other places, London, but like. I think it's actually very hard to do.
Well, that's true. What I'm trying to do is the basic income thing. Like,
so I think a very big difference between this proposal and EA Hotel is EA Hotel has about 20 people.
Yes.
For this to work, I think that you have to see it with about at least about 200 people.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
So there has to be enough people there so that it makes sense to put up service industries.
Yes. Yes.
And then because they don't actually have to produce anything. They only they have to be consumers.
Yeah. The key question is just is how do you start the process off? How do you kind of what's the minimum amount of capital that's going to be required to sort of get the whole thing growing and growing and growing? And I don't know what the thing is, but I think like one difference between cities and the company is that cities are stuck. The company can sort of shop around. The company can look for anywhere on earth where land is undervalued, whereas cities are pretty much they've got their little nugget. They've got some of them have social problems they have to deal with, whereas the company could in fact start with somewhere that it doesn't have any social capital, but it also doesn't have any negative social problems either.
Cities also aren't as planned or as thoroughly thought out as something like this.
Yes.
But countries could do this.
Yes, countries could do this. Countries could do this, yeah.
Also, to the extent that a city is more expensive than the countryside, they have already succeeded in this.
Yes, exactly. They've already succeeded, and if we can succeed and then just optimize the process to do it rapidly, then
well, some cities have succeeded. I mean, every town who wants to grow has failed, right? Like
no, but every city where a house is more expensive than a house in the countryside has to some extent succeeded in it.
But like sort of. I mean, if you buy the later things where like people continually work together, capital continually grows, and somewhere like Detroit has failed. It was succeeding for a while, and then people started to leave, and then the companies started to leave, and then there's this virtuous cycle, and it went the opposite way.
Well, basically, what I believe, that Henry George's idea is that sort of land value tax, that essentially rent is unproductive. So essentially, rent is so if you redistribute rent and capitalize everyone equally, then that actually fundamentally promotes growth, because it means everyone's got more purchasing power, everyone's got a better ability to raise credit. So I'm going to try and create optimal financial conditions, because in income taxes productive activities. Land value tax just taxes location. So essentially what I'm talking about is, when I say pay the rent in the company currency, pay basic income in the company currency, that's essentially a land value tax. So we take this thing that is unproductive, and then we use it to redistribute income in a way that stops it getting sort of sucked up to a few relatively unproductive landlords, and that should produce wealth. And then if you combine that with a low interest rate environment, where interest rates are redistributed, I think those that combine those provide better financial policies than are in place in most countries.
Okay, so another question here. So typically these like large companies, like McDonald's or Starbucks, the way they make their money is off of land value. The reason they want to move to a place is they know that they can have some of this effect. So they try to buy places that are up and coming. By building McDonald's there, they raise the value. And then that's the incentive for them to sort of help this process along.
Yeah.
Whereas if you own all the land, they're much less incentivized to come help you along with this process, because they don't get a lot of the benefit of that.
That's an interesting point. I think in that case, that probably means that we'll be dependent on small businessmen. Because like small businessmen, there are lots of small business. So the McDonald's get their land value, and they get, and that's how they do things really, really competitively. And then small businessmen kind of rent, and that's why most of the small businessmen kind of eking away their existence. So the small businessmen in this case, so small businessmen who would otherwise be renting their premises, will this time they'll still be renting the premises, but they'll be getting basic income. So the basic income, the community income, will add to their normal business income. So that would be, so yeah, I guess that means that this probably the main goal that we should really be, well, I mean, if a big corporation wants to move in, that's fine, but yeah, maybe we should be aiming for small businesses instead.
Well, I think the point of that is that if people own their own land, they're incentivized to help you with this. Entrepreneurs are incentivized to help you with raising the value of land if they own the land, but if you own the land, there's less incentive. So I think there's like something to think about there. We're actually taking away some of the incentive for entrepreneurs to help out with.
Well, it depends on the entrepreneur. Some entrepreneurs have lots of capital and they buy the land, and other entrepreneurs, other businessmen will just like rent out a premise. I mean, I think at least 50% of businesses rent their premises. So
they're renting it from somebody who owns.
Yes, exactly. You got the big boys. You got the big boys who are kind of who are doing all this sort of these strategic land purchases and starting up their strategically starting up their businesses to raise the land value, and then you have small businessmen who are just like renting renting something and eking by and just barely making ends meet, and that's a huge divide, of course. But so basically, I guess under this system, the big businesses will not profit, but the smaller businesses will be quids in because they get basic income back, so they get at least some of the rent back from the rent.
They only get basic income at stage 3.
What?
They only get basic income at stage 2. There's only this basic income.
Yeah.
And then you still need the companies to move in the yellow zone and thrive without basic income.
Unless we want to, unless in stage 1 we need to attract a few companies into the red zone. How did it, I guess this is a problem, but I think it's a problem that's worth thinking about, because it's a very profitable problem to solve if you can solve it.
So continue.
Okay. Yes. Yes. Remember the equation, time capital. Yeah, one can see that if one has access to zero or very little capital, productivity falls to zero or very low value, regardless of how one might work. A severely undercapitalized individual may not be able to produce enough wealth to survive. So sort of, here, this much wealth you're happy, this much wealth you're alive, this much wealth you're dead, basically. So full employment is capital access. We are used to our employers giving us access to capital, tangible plants, machinery, the workspace, and intangible capital like connections, reputation. If nobody knows you and you work for an employer, you can get business that you wouldn't get if you were just say, hey, I'm good at this, hire me. So there's intangible capital like connections and reputation as well. So the employer gives us capital, and then we amplify that capital with our labour. The employer then pays us some of the money which customers pay him as wages. Is going to pay him as wages. Probably should be a comma there. Keeps some to maintain and expand his business capital, and retains a further fraction for profit for himself. So this is how business works today. We then use the money we receive as wages to purchase goods and services which others provide us with, the things we require to survive or otherwise want. So employers give us capital. We amplify the value of that capital with our labour, export it to customers. Then the customers pay money back. The employer takes some of the money, pays some of the money to us as wages, and then we import services that we need to survive with those wages. That's how most people live today. Full employment, self-provision. Jobs are not required for productivity. Being hired by someone else who pays wages is not required for productivity. All that is required for productivity is access to the capital and to optimally apply one's energy and industry to that capital. It is just as productive to build a house yourself out of raw materials as it is to devote that same labour to building it for someone else. It is immaterial whether you grow food for yourself or someone else. The quantity of wealth produced will be identical if the quantity of food produced is identical. What is lost in economies of scale is gained by lower transport requirements. So if you don't have to commute to the grocery store because, especially if you're living in the countryside where the grocery store is 10 miles away, you save yourself a lot of money travelling back and forth. Even though obviously if you're doing things for yourself, there's going to be losses in economies of scale. Another advantage of self-provision is that the supplier intimately knows the customer because the supplier is the customer. So often, in businesses there can be, the supplier can try and produce something and then say, "Do you want to buy it?" The customer's like, "No, I don't really want it." So if you are the customer, you always know what you want. So you can always redirect your labour to whatever is most useful to you when you're working to provide for yourself. With self-provision, you are both your own boss and your own customer. This naturally creates perfect job security as you can always hire yourself. So essentially, self-provision is a 100% secure job. It requires some capital access. Thus, by providing people with access to capital, even a modest community income, paid out reliably so as to maximize its credit efficiency, could enable industrious people to multiply the value of that capital with their efforts to provide a good life for themselves. This is like for example, you can't build a house out of nothing, but you can build a house out of raw materials. So if you purchase the raw materials cheaply and then build your own house, for example, or the same with you can't having tools to repair your house or that kind of stuff. It essentially allows you to sort of apply your labour to provide benefit for yourself. If getting access to the capital you need to use your time productively is employment, then community income will create full employment. So community income gives everyone access to capital, and as such, that gives everyone access to productively applying their time. Because to productively apply your time, you usually need tools and stuff like that, or raw materials. Essentially, that every productive activity requires input. The input requires a little bit of money. The output usually generates more money, and essentially labor amplifies capital. It usually doesn't. It's much harder to make. It's easier to make more with less through your labor than to make something out of nothing. Capital access. Capital access is about productivity, and if we assume behaving productively is employment, then it's essentially full employment. Full employment, stable wages and a flexible job market simultaneously. Employers don't like workers who come and go as the worker pleases. Employers want workers who come and go as the employer pleases. This is why working two jobs is difficult. If two bosses expect you to work for them on a flexible basis, what happens if they both expect you to work for them at the same time? But if one boss is the worker, if one boss is the self-provider, if you're your own boss, then the worker can work for the other employer when a job comes up, while diverting their efforts back to self-provision immediately when work is slow. So people are kind of used to working for themselves and sometimes doing the odd gig here and there. Then they can sort of immediately switch from sort of immediately when like labour dries up, they can immediately kind of switch back to sort of providing for themselves. And if they're on community income, they always have that kind of feedstock of capital, so they'll always be able to make more of that through their efforts. Homesteading, basically. Furthermore, because it's possible to survive through working to provide for yourself on a community income, so by working to like homestead or whatever on a community income, without working at all, without selling your labour to others at all, just by kind of working to do your own house, people will always have the option to not work for others. This will put a floor on wages, which is good for workers. So if the wages, if you have a feedstock of capital, which you can use to buy tools and stuff like that, and paint the house or kind of or whatever, or grow food in the garden or something like that, do something productive with your time. If the employer doesn't pay you a wage that exceeds the amount that you could productively do applying your own time for your own benefit, then nobody's going to accept that job. So that's going to put a floor on wages. If people say, oh, what am I going to do with that money? I could do more just working for myself on community income than on the wage you're offering. Then no one's going to take it. So this puts a floor on wages. However, because people can immediately switch from self-provision to working for someone else, as opposed to suddenly switching employers without notice, which the employer you leave will not appreciate, self-provision also creates a reserve of workers for new businesses to employ people fast. So if you already have a job and someone says you want another job, that's a big decision, because maybe your existing employer you've got a good relationship with him and he's going to give you a job for a long time. Whereas if you abandon him, go for a new employer, and the new employer sacks you, you could lose your security. So it's a big decision to decide to switch employers. But if you're just sitting around, kind of farming your own, doing your own thing, homesteading or whatever, and a job comes up, you can just go off and work that job immediately. So a bunch of homesteaders who kind of work part time creates a flexible buffer of, creates essentially a reserve of workers that can instantly be tapped into, much more rapidly than any other kind of full employment. Yes, self-provision both props up wages and prevents them rising too high. So it props up wages, because if the wages are too low, people will just go off and self-provide instead on their community income. But if wages rise higher, then that's going to kind of drain people away from self-provision into the workforce, and that's going to stop wages rising too quickly either. So it stabilizes wages. By stabilizing wages, self-provision helps businessmen to predictably budget their expansion costs, as well as helping workers essentially to a certain extent, planning is what generates all wealth. But when people plan how to apply their time carefully, that's when the most wealth is created. And the more stable the environment, the easier it is to plan. If everything's oscillating all around the place, it's harder to make long-term plans for the future. So I think things like stable interest rates, stable wages, all these kind of macroeconomics, a sort of stable macroeconomic environment is probably the environment that I think is probably most conducive to wealth creation. Full employment economic growth. Stable wages and reserve of self-providers will prop up consumer purchasing power while simultaneously enabling businesses to plan expansion. So the community income, will mean they're always buying something, and also it'll also create self-providers and create stable wages, and I think it's going to be great for economic growth. This is the optimal triumph for promoting economic growth. Furthermore, full employment will also reduce production of social bads such as crime, which damage tangible and intangible goods, destroy lives. The reduction of bads creates full employment and fair wages, also promote optimal economic growth. Because people aren't twiddling their thumbs being completely unemployed and useless, they're actually homesteading, they're less likely to commit crimes. Well, that's what I'm saying anyway, that's the argument, the case I'm making. Solving automation. Valuing people over capital. Capitalism has become increasingly anti-human. Capitalism increasingly seems to aim to automate humans away. Human workers are viewed as liabilities which require salaries and can potentially take lawsuits out against their employer. Many modern companies just want machinery and software coordinated by a handful of super managers and technicians. The bulk of humanity is viewed as increasingly unnecessary and worthless. By placing real estate appreciation caused by human communities at the heart of our business plan, social solutions makes people, once more, the engine of value creation, as they should be. Avoiding economic collapse. Another problem with automation is the tendency towards miniaturization and generalization, 3D printing, flexible manufacturing, all that kind of stuff, that it's possible to manufacture all these consumer goods that require huge factories in the olden days are going to be manufactured in much smaller 3D printing machines. So the question is, if nobody needs large amounts of capital, how are investors going to get a return? I mean, the investors get the return because there's a demand for big hunks of capital. And so if there's no demand, then return on capital dries up and the entire capitalist system collapses. Now in the far future we may not need capitalism, we may not even need money. Maybe if money comes from scarcity and if you can get everything you want, then you don't really need money to ration it out. But there could be a very painful, horrible, chaotic transition period where you kind of need a bit of capital. We're not quite there yet, but at the same time the need for capital is going down, so returns on capital are going down, and the entire economic growth goes into economic contraction, and capitalist systems can't really survive with economic contraction for very long. So there could be a really painful intervening period as a result of this miniaturization of manufacturing and which essentially undermines economies of scale, which undermines the requirement for capital and will basically completely destroy economic growth potentially. Fortunately, paying an income to communities of 100 people to create social capital, real estate value, will always require large capital concentrations. It takes a big hunk of money to get 100 people, to get that sort of seed of 100 people into new real estate and stuff like that. Thus, demand for large investment to generate social capital and the returns therefrom will remain strong even as the returns for material capital disappear away due to this kind of miniaturization of manufacturing and the proliferation of intelligence. Just generally, that it will be harder to create monopolies in the material capitalist manufacturing techniques. This will sustain the capitalist system. So a growth in social capital. The growth in social capital outweighs the contraction in material capital. Then you can keep the capitalist system going, even as the material capital, even as the profits from material capital go down, the profits from social capital compensate. This will sustain the capitalist system even after the full ramifications of the